Since February last year, the Royal Commission of Inquiry has been gathering evidence, although noting that it is not looking to find fault or assign blame, but instead focusing on capturing the lessons learned from the pandemic. As a result, the Commission has not held public hearings, but has sought to hold a wide range of meetings and interviews with individuals, organisations and communities of interest. The scope of the Commission's terms of reference has been criticised by some since its inception, including as to a number of matters which were specifically excluded from its scope, including vaccine efficacy and monetary policy. Following the election, the new government committed to expanding the scope of the inquiry, and as such, the Minister of Internal Affairs, Brooke van Velden, earlier this year announced they would be broadening the existing inquiry, examining New Zealand's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, encompassing the appointment of new commissioners, a widening of the terms of reference, as well as an extension of the inquiry until February 2026. So, the Minister joins me now. Please welcome Brooke van Velden. Brooke, hello.
Hi, Leah. Thanks for having me on.
Firstly, Brooke, before we jump in, why is it important to expand the scope of the Commission's inquiry into the pandemic?
Look, what ACT heard well during COVID and during the campaign, which we campaigned on and now we've delivered on, is the fact that Kiwis didn't feel like the original terms of reference adequately addressed issues that they'd had as effects in their own lives during the COVID lockdowns and vaccine mandates. So what we've done as a party and now as a government is expanded those terms of reference to include things like the vaccine mandates, vaccine safety, the effects of the lockdowns, especially the extended Auckland and Northland lockdown, whether or not we got procurement right for testing and tracing, and looking at whether we got the balance right between the overall getting rid of COVID issue and other effects on healthcare, education, debt levels, inflation, business activity. There's a lot that was going on at the time that people weren't happy about, but wasn't adequately addressed. So ACT listened, we've expanded the terms of reference, and I think putting in place these new commissioners, giving them the specific scope of inquiry will lead to a much better result so that we can look at things as well, like whether or not it impacted social division and isolation, so that in the future, if we have another pandemic, we can actually have a better response than what we had by the previous government.
Yeah, well, actually, you touched on a few things there, Brooke. And as I said in the intro, you have finalised, well, the government's finalised the detailed terms of reference for Phase 2, and specifically will review key decisions taken by the government in 2021 and 2022. You touched on the use of the vaccines and the use of lockdowns. What in particular will it look at? Let's say the lockdowns you mentioned. Did you mention Auckland?
Yeah, absolutely. They'll be looking at the nationwide lockdown, but in particular, the extended Auckland and Northland lockdowns.
And that was because, Auckland and Northland particularly was hit quite hard with lockdowns, wasn't it, Brooke? Went longer and had a few more.
Oh, absolutely. At the time, I was receiving phone calls from people who were beside themselves because their, children were withdrawn in their homes, missing their contact with their friends. People were told not to go to school. And we had people, very frustrated that they could see the rest of the country being able to move out of those lockdowns, but Auckland and Northland were still, for weeks on end, plunged further into lockdowns. So we've got some really good truths that we need to find, which is, did the government follow advice that was given to them at the time, or were they given advice but they discarded it? And what were they looking at in terms of how we were reacting and what policies we were putting in place versus what other countries were putting in place? And whether or not the policies had actually led to social division and social isolation. I've got good faith in these three commissioners that we're appointing, that they will go away, they'll analyse for over a year all the evidence, gather information, even from members of the public who will submit, but come to the truth of the matter, because I think that's what's been missing.
Can we have a quick look at these appointments that you've just kind of talked about? Who are they and what are their roles?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got 3 new commissioners. Firstly, Grant Illingworth KC will be the chair of the commission. He's a barrister with decades worth of experience at every level of the court system. He's a litigation expert. And one of the things that he brings to the table is that this commission has the ability to conduct some public hearings. Now, if those hearings are to be done in public, I think it's very important that we have someone of his level of expertise who'll be able to do those. But importantly, he also brings to the table expertise in constitutional and public law. Secondly, we've got Judy Kavanagh, a very experienced economist and public policy expert. And thirdly, Anthony Hill, who has decades worth of experience again in public health. So I think all 3 combined bring to the table legal, health and economics perspective, which we know were all very important for the COVID pandemic.
Every business was affected during COVID, as you know, Brooke, and will phase 2 of the inquiry look into the impact of decisions that were taken? I know you mentioned debt, also inflation, business activity. Was that all part of a phase 2?
Yeah, absolutely. Business activity is right up there. We know a lot of industries really struggled with, vaccine mandates, as an example, but they also really struggled with their own debt and trying to actually get their staff into their premises when we had 2 metre distancing and a whole bunch of contact tracing requirements. So it's looking at overall, did we get the balance right between the minimising the effect of COVID and what the effect would have been on business activity? Now, it won't go into detail on individual businesses because we've got to make sure that, we're getting it right in terms of how much we even resource the inquiry and make sure that it will actually report back in a reasonable time frame. But they will be going down to the details of industry-specific areas or geographic areas.